Well, hello, and welcome to another ImagineFX video tutorial. I'm Tom Foster, and you may know me from 2000 AD, the Judge Dredd magazine, for which I contribute artwork now and again, or from my previous video tutorials for this magazine. We're going to be working in a combination of 3D and 2D software today. Typically, I prefer to limit my tutorials to drawings rather than full-on digital paintings, although I am working digitally, just because I tend to find that if you're trying to communicate the sort of basic principle of something in kind of illustration terms, it's usually best to try and kind of nail the drawing stage first before you get into questions of rendering, unless the issue is one specifically to do with painted rendering. But here I'm just trying to kind of give you the best possible start for composing your scenes in a way that is really relatively kind of efficient but also effective. If that doesn't sound too kind of cold and sterile. So this tutorial is all about groups, how to draw groups quickly, relatively quickly anyway, not have them eat too heavily into your schedule. Starting off in DAZ Studio here, which is 3D modeling, or rather 3D posing software, which regular viewers of my tutorials ought to be fairly familiar with. It's free for the most part. Usually the download of the software is free. It comes with lots of models, default models. These characters that I'm using are Genesis figures, and the latest version of the Genesis figure always tends to come free with the software. And all the lighting and camera presets and everything, most of them are free as well. You can buy assets as well, like the hair and the hair for at least the male character here, and most of the clothing I did purchase, but they're not massively expensive, and you can usually sort of cobble something together, regardless of if you have if you have all the right resources that would be sort of the most kind of appropriate. You can usually you can create kind of primitive shapes and stuff to suggest most forms, so you don't have to spend a lot of money to get a lot of use out of it. But today we're mostly talking about how to do crowds, and I suppose since we're starting in DAZ Studio, it'd be a good idea to lay out some of the principles of how you would start putting a scene like this together, what elements you would establish early, and in order to sort of best lead into talking about that, I usually ask for questions on Facebook and Twitter from people, curious people wanting to know how the process is done. And I ask for questions on the topic that I'm covering in whatever tutorial I'm doing. So I asked I asked people for questions on crowd dynamics and everything, and Cameron Foster, my brother, asks, do Leon Alberti's observations from 1435 still ground your approach to crowd scenes when he says, once again, the painter should take great care to include different character types, movements, clothing, and gestures. However, the resultant pictorial richness must be controlled and graceful, never overdone. Obscenity and the repetition of gestures must be avoided at all costs. Now, thanks, Cameron, for that question, but I mean, Leon Alberti, it does seem to be one of those guys like, Descartes, Pythagoras, who just, they're just pointing out the obvious. Everybody knows to draw an interesting crowd, you have to have interesting, a little bit of difference in people. It's like, you know, I know Descartes exists. That all that cogito ergo sum stuff. I know he exists. Otherwise, he couldn't have said that. And Pythagoras, you know, the square, all the square stuff. I mean, everybody knows that. You know, any kid in secondary school knows that. So, you know, just because he's kind of in a privileged position, and he points out, and everybody, oh, it's very clever. Yeah, yeah. Um, so, you know, Leonard Berti is just not a hack as far as I'm concerned. Um, so his words, though, about character types and movement and clothing and gestures, banal and obvious as they might be, um, you know, are correct, I suppose. So what's uh, what's going on with the figures that I'm using at the moment? Well, I'm trying to give them some kind of character in the poses and everything. Um, and I'm trying to create a sense of sort of visual variety to keep the reader interested, suggesting that each one of these people um, who are kind of besieging our main characters or our primary characters or closest to the character, closest to the camera, that they each have some kind of personality, some kind of individual consciousness, I suppose, um, and that they have their own um, little nuances and characteristics and stuff that define them as individuals, rather than just putting them all in the same pose and everything. And I will go on in the at the Photoshop stage to give them slightly different costumes, even though they are supposed to all be similar looking. Um, you might notice that I am doing this tutorial. In the video, I do the three different approaches in a different order from the way that they are in the magazine, but it was easiest since this approach is the most detailed and the one that has the most kind of elements all at play in the one 3D model. I decided to do it first and then, you know, adapt it a little bit for the other two. Sorry. Um, so this approach is this one is kind of inevitably quite time consuming. This is the most time consuming of the three. This is the sorry. Could you just I can't quite tutorial so named because you've got characters standing right in front of the viewer, in between them and the crowd, which, you know, helps us to not have to draw as much, and also creates, you know, a good sense of drama, depth, um, all those good things. Um, and also you'll notice that I'm not uh, I don't have as many models in the render as will ultimately appear in the picture. I've used only about 5 or 6 and just or 7, I think, and I put them at different places and done more than one render so that I can combine them. Just because, you know, you don't want to slow down the computer too much when you're working in DAS. It can be a right nightmare. Um, and also, I should point out that I know that with the kind of image quality that's appearing in the magazine, I know I'm not kind of fooling anyone into thinking that this is anything other than a kind of 3D render that has been a bit manipulated and drawn over. Um, Obviously, time constraints can be difficult when if you want to, you know, create a fully rendered uh, comic book image. This is more just to illustrate the sort of fundamental points. Sorry about my slightly blocked up sounding voice. I am struggling with a bit of a cold, as you'll know if you listen to my other tutorial that should be accompanying this issue of ImagineFX, if not one in the very near future, on capes and capes getting caught on things. But I'm recording them both on the same day, and I have a horrible cold, which is not entirely unusual for me while recording these things. So every now and again, I may have to excuse myself and turn away from the mic and do a bit of a blow the nose a little bit, which is something I think I'm going to have to do now. So just excuse me 1 second. Sorry about that. Can't be helped, I'm afraid. Often when I end up doing a video tutorial, it's at the end of a very long period of work, and I tend to get my immune system tends to go down. So that's what's happened on this occasion, and it's one of the worst examples. But hopefully I'll be up and about again in no time, ready to give you some great artwork, which I'm sure you'll appreciate. Filling in the individual characters here with similar, related, but not identical patterns on the costume. No one or no two characters here are completely alike. Each one has their own kind of, well, not livery, I suppose, but each one has their own look, different markings, tribal markings, maybe. Don't want to deliver anything too offensive. Incidentally, if you're wondering, the previous tutorial I did, the one with the capes in question, which, as I say, should also be in this issue, featured yet another white male character, for which I apologise. My diversity is I need to keep on top of that. But so here there was a reason why I didn't make that character female, incidentally, because the cape was sort of being snagged on something, and the character was turning around and looking, and it was all a bit kind of slightly kind of clumsy looking, and I didn't want to, invoke the spectre of, condescending kind of pin-up art. I know a lot of people really like pin-up art, but I mean, I didn't want to degrade a female character, so and I thought that if I had that image with a female character, it could come across as being a bit sort of, oh, ditzy female superhero, and I didn't want that. As for the character being white, no real excuses there, I'm afraid. There was no reason why they had to be. And I know, I'm sure there are people sitting thinking, you shouldn't have to apologise for using a white character. And you would be right, you shouldn't have to, but, it's usually a good idea to, if you can make them more diverse, then why not? And enrich the visual landscape and indeed cultural landscape of comics. A worthy goal which is not necessarily being upheld in this image with its, borderline offensive portrayal of a sort of tribal culture. I've done my best to impart the figure some dignity, but not 100% sure I was successful on that front. But yeah, I thought to compensate for the fact that I didn't have that it was yet another white male character in the other one. I thought in this one I would have some kind of ambiguously coloured female characters in their, potentially in their hundreds. At least that's the implication anyway. And as for how I've kind of put the crowd together, like I say, put a few key figures who stand out and draw the eye in kind of key locations, sort of about equal distance apart, but not so equal that it looks kind of contrived and too mathematical. And try and put them in sort of reasonably pleasing positions in terms of the composition, trying to observe rules of thirds and all that stuff. Um, and I think it's sort of relatively successful in this one. In all three, I think the compositional sort of point that's being made uh, generally sort of fairly sound and well executed. The second one, the whoa, just pull back there a little, please. That one is probably the weakest of the three. It's in terms of composition, it's a slightly dull panel. That character on the left is drifting a little bit too far across to the left, um, and creating a bit of kind of dead space between the two figures. Um, and sort of is creeping a bit too near that panel border. And it's also kind of not the most well rendered image of the three. Sorry, I'm just going to have to clear my nose again. Apologies for that. Great, that's done. Um, I've tried to give the figures some fairly dark shadows under the eyes and uh, mouth, just to sort of suggest a sort of spotlight, which I did use. I did use kind of spotlight settings for this, but you can always add to the drama of those a little bit by accentuating the shadows in the at the sort of drawing stage. Apologies if it's going quite quickly on screen, and you're having maybe difficulty following the brush sizes and everything. If I played it back at any any less of a multiple of the speed that it happens in real time, it would just have gone on for way too long. And I do like to try and keep these tutorials to an hour or so, just because it would become incredibly tedious, I think, after a while. It's not to say that it's necessarily a complete thrill ride at the moment, but here we go. In terms of brush sizes and things, you don't need to worry too much. I'm just kind of resizing based on kind of by eye, looking at something going, is that a bit too thick a line? Yes, I'll make it a bit thinner. No, I'll make it a bit thicker. Um, and it's just a standard brush tool, and standard type of brush. Very kind of, or relatively cheap Wacom tablet. It's about 30 quid when I got it. I always say this on my commentaries, just because I want to make it clear that you can get reasonable results from inexpensive materials. I mean, traditional materials is often the ideal way to do it, but if you are working digitally, which in this instance, being a video tutorial, was the most intuitive way to work, then you can achieve dramatic and sort of interesting visuals without having to buy a whole load of different types of brush presets and software and things like that. I mean, you'll notice the line quality isn't superb in this effort, and that's just a sort of a concession to time. The tutorial is more focused on how to deal with kind of composition and things to make crowd scenes effective, without having to go super detail, without having to overload the panel with detail that will be very time consuming to render. But to do an even more elaborate and clean looking job, you wouldn't need much more in the way of resources that I'm using here. I mean, if you've got brush settings and things that you like using, then go ahead. I like to work in as close to kind of pure black and white as possible. And this is more like pencils rather than finished inks for a comic. It just so happens that they are in pure black and white, but they are a bit sort of sketchier. So forgive me for that, please. I'm an incredibly slow inker, and it wouldn't necessarily give you any greater understanding of the approach that I'm trying to get across if I went and did the full comics treatment on it. No disrespect, obviously. So I don't think you're worthy. So anyway, this is. I think we're sort of coming near close to the end of this particular one of the three. This is. I chose a sort of straight kind of up and down angle for this. No high angles or low angles, just so that I would only really have to draw the kind of front members of the crowd, and I could suggest the rest by putting them in shadow and everything, and just having a kind of little head and ears and neck and shoulders all in shadow behind some of the foreground characters, and that works quite well, I think. And it's sort of atmospheric and everything, and it doesn't appear like an effort to conserve on detail. Putting those foreground figures there, having background characters kind of disappear into darkness, it seems like a dramatic decision, a choice to create a sense of visual dynamism. And in a lot of ways it is. It's a way of trying to kill two birds with one stone. For a lot of panels, I will start out with an idea where I think, right, how can I, like for example with this one, how can I not have to draw quite so many people in this panel and quite so much detail? Well, it's a big crowd, and it's got to be a big splash image and everything. So how about having some debris or something in front of them? And I thought that's just going to look too contrived. I could have some smoke rising up in front of them, but then, there might not necessarily be smoke. There's no reason for there to be smoke in this image. So I eventually arrived at the idea of placing the cameras in front. That seems like a nice, artistically justified compromise, and I think improves the image. Art often thrives on limitations and having to meet difficult or answer difficult problems. The other two images are more or less just kind of as I imagined them. There's not a huge amount of... I knew as soon as I knew I was going to have one that was quite close up and at a relatively low angle, and one that was far away enough that you could get a real sense of a crowd without having to go into too much detail on it. I was pretty happy, and knew sort of fairly instinctively what way to go with it. Sorry, I just need to blow my nose again. Just adding some more details there to the heads of the characters. It's fairly self-explanatory kind of at this point. Once you've established the rule of making the shadows around the eyes and under the nose and everything a bit darker, it's just a case of kind of making up some patterns to put on the faces, and finding the right weight of line for the outlines of the characters. Line weight can be incredibly important in comic book art, because it can suggest lots of things. It could suggest depth. It suggests the contour of a three-dimensional object, and the tempting sort of tradition is to kind of vary the line weights as much as possible. Have a lot of very kind of fluid, dynamic lines that are very thick in the middle and taper off towards the edges and everything, and that can be very effective and very expressive. But I never underestimate the power of a sort of solid, even-weighted line to suggest three-dimensional forms. Often works a lot better, because the fact that it's kind of consistent and everything makes the object seem more real. Very kind of flowing, ornate lines can often actually make an image look more two-dimensional, just by dint of being, I guess, in a way, kind of artificial or sort of flourishes. You know, they don't necessarily make for a more grounded look to your visuals. But I mean, it's personal preference a lot of the time. And you know, people like Al Williamson and everything used different line weights incredibly well. So it's or varying line weights incredibly well. So I'm not going to trash the idea, but it's just that the even line weight sort of way of looking at things often gets kind of overlooked. So there's that. I'm definitely coming towards the end of this one now. These are the last couple of characters to get there, to get the sort of makeup treatment or tattoo treatment, whatever it is that's on their bodies. I have kind of tightened it, added little anatomical details and things. The 3D models are good for proportions and things, but often the actual kind of minutiae of the body is not really all that accurate. So you've got to kind of go in and play about with them a little bit to get them looking right. And that's where your traditional drawing skills come in. At the end of the day, how good the finished product looks will usually be down to how good your drawing skills are, rather than how good the software you've used is. I mean, you can certainly have a lot of advantages to using 3D modeling software, and it will often improve the quality of your work. But the finished item tends to rest on the quality of it tends to rest on your instincts and your knowledge and everything. It's still possible to create a 3D render and sort of draw over it and have it look rotten, or even present the 3D render as a kind of finished piece, and that almost always looks rotten because it's usually very obvious that's all you've done, because 3D models like that tend to, you know, have a lot of, whether subconscious or consciously, people tend to be aware of lots of little limitations on using certainly the kind of less advanced 3D models. And drawing, the eye of the artist, if I can use that term without sounding like a complete person, the eye of the artist usually interprets things in a sort of more intuitive way than a computer does, in a more human way. And accounts for or sort of compensates for the two-dimensional nature of the image. It just does a lot of that automatically, your kind of brain. Whereas obviously a 3D render doesn't. A 3D render is you know, has no real kind of, I hesitate to use the term intelligence, because obviously there's a lot of artificial intelligence involved, but it has no real judgment. It never goes, that doesn't look quite right. Because in comics terms, if something doesn't look right, it usually isn't. In fact, it almost invariably isn't. Even if it is right and doesn't look right, it's wrong. That is also kind of a paraphrasing of a quote by some famous artist who, to be honest, I can't remember who it was who said that. But it is a kind of universal truth in comics. The artwork should generally look, and that actually applies to pretty much all artwork. It should look right, even if that means kind of breaking the rules a little of what is actually factually correct. Anyway, just kind of making a few adjustments here. I'll probably be doing or touching up the background a little bit in a second. There we go. In order to create a sense of kind of atmosphere and drama with, you know, fairly quick and simple approach, and just sort of fill some of that dead space, so there's not a big ugly white space in the panel. Obviously, if the stuff's going to be coloured, that doesn't matter quite so much. You can let the colourist take care of that. But to be honest, it's usually good practice to have stuff look as good as possible and as filled out as possible at the black and white stage, so that there are less things the colorist can kind of do wrong. Not that I'm in any way impugning the abilities of colorists. Many of them are very highly skilled, complete artists in their own right. Just 1 second, sorry, while I clear my nose again. Oh. And now moving on to the second in our series of solutions. I mean, I say that I didn't fitter around with the idea or the composition of this idea too much, but actually there was some experimentation to get where I got. If I were just drawing it from scratch rather than starting with a 3D model, it would probably have been, I would probably have arrived at a composition much quicker, because I don't have to worry about posing and things, and I can just have characters' heads be at whatever height I want. But trying to figure out the logistics of actually placing these people at a kind of reasonably realistic distance from one another and creating a compelling composition was a little bit harder than I expected. That, as is often the case with stuff like this, you don't realise how many liberties you take with sort of heights and perspective and things when you're just drawing stuff off the top of your head. When you're trying to manipulate a real world model, it can often be substantially more difficult. And many people would argue that is an argument for, or that is, you know, they would make a case for not using 3D models for that very reason. That often you arrive at the far more kind of intuitive composition, the composition that looks right, by just drawing from your head. But that, you know, that has all kinds of disadvantages in terms of, if you want to do dynamic angles and perspective and foreshortening and things, then it can be a very difficult test of your anatomy and sort of mathematical understanding of the properties of, you know, people and forms and things. And usually, if you can get some help with that from a resource, it can be quite a good idea to do so. In the way that I apply these 3D elements, I tend to think of them as in a way just another form of photoreference, but a form of photoreference that you can manipulate more extensively, where you can actually kind of physically manipulate the models, their size, their proportions, their sort of level of fitness, their facial expressions, the lighting, to a degree that you couldn't realistically expect to do with photoreference. But photoreference is still an invaluable aid. It's a lot better for understanding or kind of observing more nuanced details of anatomy, sort of little areas, kind of creases and wrinkles and things, and the shapes of muscles in certain poses and all that kind of stuff that the 3D models just don't quite manage to deliver. I mean, what you see here, this 3D render is quite close. You know, the proportions are mostly right and everything. In some ways, it's better than the image I ended up with. But like I say, that one was the weakest of the three, so I apologise for that. But had I been completely on form that day, it would have looked way better than the 3D render. Again, the quality of the finished image almost always comes down to your fundamental drawing ability, and in this case, what I produced wasn't the strongest as a result, even though I was working with essentially a kind of ironclad template of what it was that I was trying to draw. Here I'm worried the face is looking too masculine. Not that matters socially, obviously, but I did want it to be kind of clear that it was a female face, and I was making it a bit too kind of angular, not rounded enough. Um, as you'll know from if you've watched any of my other tutorials, my tutorials on drawing the face, the female face does tend to have different deposits of fat in it, greater deposits of fat in the cheeks, um, and a slightly narrower and less muscular jawline, which leads to a sort of different overall shape, and also a less defined, less kind of defined geometry on the nose as well. It tends to be a little more smooth over the bridge of the nose. Not by any means universal rules, but general principles that will help clarify your image. I mean, here, yeah, I don't end up necessarily with the strongest faces. But the sort of takeaway from this image was supposed to be, here's how you can present a composition that tells the story without having to draw masses and masses of people. Inevitably, though, at some point you probably will have to do a bigger establishing shot like the one at the bottom, which is why I included it. It's if you only draw crowd scenes in close up or very, very far away, people will cotton on to it quite quickly, you know. Anything that sort of seems counterintuitive from a kind of directorial point of view will tend to stand out, and people will become aware that it was perhaps done for the purposes of convenience or through inexperience. It's funny how things like that people often don't notice or claim not to notice. You know, like directing in comics and films and things. How much they do notice when it's wrong, and that's not a slight on their the kind of critical faculties. And I mean, it's natural that if something looks that something like that should stand out. Strong directing is often less noticeable than weak directing. There are very few directors in film, for example, who I would say have a visual style that is sort of distinctive and that people notice as they're watching a film, that doesn't detract from it in some way. You know, somebody like Stanley Kubrick is one of those rare exceptions where you do tend to languish in the visuals a little bit and really really appreciate those as you see them without it, you know, destroying the story. You can still follow the story usually quite easily. Anyway, that's all very dry and not particularly interesting, I suppose. But yes, try and, I mean, particularly when you're using 3D models and you've got to, and you're sort of staying relatively close to the limitations of the real world in terms of what kinds of shots you can achieve. Although you can usually achieve pretty much anything that you imagine at your sort of thumbnail sketch. If you do thumbnail sketches, well, I would recommend doing thumbnail sketches before attempting a full drawing, particularly in comics. You can pull off mostly anything, but since you are kind of using the constructs of real form or simulated three-dimensional forms and things, you do have to think more like a film director in some ways, because you have to compensate for the slightly maybe static or stiff qualities that using 3D models can result in. I don't even know if that's it. I can't remember how I started that sentence, so I'm not sure if that's the correct way to end it. But yes, generally, you kind of have to make your shots even more dynamic and more interesting and more well balanced in terms of lighting and everything in order to justify that adherence to some kind of realism. whereas if you're working if your drawings are far more kind of imaginative and perhaps cartoonish, but obviously not every type of abstracted drawing is cartoonish. But if you are working in a more abstract or stylistic way, you can usually create that drama and momentum and stuff with just in the visuals themselves, like the elements of the visuals, rather than necessarily in your composition. Although, if you start at the drawing board without using the computer to do your compositions or to help create your compositions, then you will often, that just naturally go towards something that kind of is dynamic and visually pleasing, rather than having to struggle with the inherent limitations of using actual models and things. Hang on just one moment while I clear my nose again. Oh. Incidentally, I don't know how effective, as I may have mentioned on my other commentary, I don't know how effective my attempts to stifle the noise of my nose blowing are on this recording. I suppose I could have done it, just done a little recording next time I needed to blow my nose before I did the commentary, and judged it that way. But to be honest, I mean, I don't really want to get up and go to a different side of the room. But like, I'm using a very rudimentary, even in my recording, I'm using very rudimentary software, which the only options on which seem to be, play, pause, stop, record, and save. But that's about it. I don't have a cough button or anything. I'd like a cough button. That would be great. Actually, I should look into that, given how often I seem to be indisposed when doing these commentaries. See, here I'm starting to feel like the face is a bit more feminine looking, or more clearly female. I think that's a better way of putting it. Feminine suggests sort of, personality traits almost, even though it is just a kind of scientific term, I guess. But yes, it's more clearly a female figure now, which is what I wanted. Although there is a sort of ambiguity about these figures, they could be, they could be in some way differently gendered. They may not be human. They may be, not that I'm suggesting anybody who doesn't conform to traditional gender norms is not human by any stretch of the imagination. No, I'm not saying that. I just mean that they may also be, these people may also be another species that has different. Oh God, I'm getting myself in an awful hole here. Yes. So anyway, the important thing was I wanted to diminish the kind of more overtly masculine qualities of the face I was drawing there. So let's move on. Creating a separate layer to tighten up this drawing. That's something I do quite a lot when I'm drawing on the computer, which I usually only do for these tutorials. But rather than sort of penciling and inking or whatever, I will draw on one layer, reduce it to about 33% opacity, and then create another layer on top of it, and draw on that, which allows me to kind of refine my lines a bit. Generally good practice, I find, when drawing in this medium. It's a bit of a, as I say, it's a bit of a kind of scratchy and not particularly smooth or clean way of working. But in a way I quite like that, because when you're working with computer, it can be very easy for your images, maybe not so much in digital painting, but certainly in digital drawing. It can be very easy for your images to develop a kind of mechanical or slightly too clean look. And I do like the sort of slight messiness that creating these lines and then just hacking away at them with the eraser tool gives. It's not something I would choose to use for my finished comic book art in general, but I think it works better for these tutorials than just than using something like Manga Studios line tools and things. I don't know that much about Manga Studio. I ought to give it a try instead of just dismissing it. But yeah, there's something sort of endearing about the kind of primitive approach. It kind of harkens back to the sort of slightly more raggedy line work of a lot of 50s comic book artists and stuff. If I can elevate myself so gauchely. I mean, can you turn gauche into an adverb? I don't know. I think that's a fat question. If I may be so gauche, that's what I should have said. Well, maybe not should have said. That's what an incredibly pretentious and pompous arty person would say. Yeah, this drawing pretty much finished now. We're getting there anyway. A couple of little touches to add, but for the most part, the crowd itself, well, there's one more face to add, I suppose, or one more suggestion of a face on the right to add. I can't remember how long this one took to draw. I think maybe about an hour, somewhere in that ballpark. I think it could have been as long as 2 hours, but it was nowhere near as long as the first one or the third. If you're looking at them in the magazine, and the one coming up was very quick. I think it only took about 25 minutes from the point where I rendered my scenes in Dad's studio to the actual Photoshop session. I think only took about 25 minutes, which for a crowd scene isn't bad. And in a lot of ways, it's the one that looks most effective. I mean, the bottom one, the wider shot, does look quite effective, I think. It looks maybe more dramatic. But I mean, it's certainly clear. It is a crowd, and I mean, establishing shots often take quite a while. I mean, granted, there's no real background detail here, but then you're seeing it from so far overhead that there probably wouldn't be that much detail on the ground itself. You wouldn't want to add too much detail on the ground anyway, because it would, having that plus the crowd of the horde of people would be quite sort of visually annoying. All that detail, it would end up being just a bit of a morass, as I believe I say in the body of the text with this article. So yeah, I'm doing the same kind of atmospheric little touches here, just to create a sense of space and to create a better balance of black and white. It's usually good to aim for a kind of 50-50 split of black and white in a panel. Yeah, I mean, that's a very loose rule. There's lots of panels where you would use far more black or far more white, depending on what's called for, but it's nice to have a balance, a fairly strong balance. And not to just have areas of kind of dead space. Negative space is fine, because the purpose of negative space is to kind of draw your attention to things. So negative space around important objects and figures and things, that can be okay, but generally speaking, only in the rarest of examples would I use a whole lot of it. But yeah, dead space, which in other words would be sort of just empty space that serves no real purpose, other than to save you from drawing lots of things, is pretty bad, and it looks lazy. Again, it's something a colourist can compensate for if you're really up against it, and I've certainly had my arse staved at the colouring stage on that account in the past. But I'd say it's good practice to try and keep most of your space lively and have something, and have all the space in the panel or on the page serve some purpose, even if it is negative space. Now I wasn't really happy with this render, too many conflicting shadows and things. I tried to import it into Photoshop and do something with it, but I wasn't happy with the result. Um, I also tried to just kind of use it as the basis for the entire crowd scene with only those few placed figures. And that was just resulting in, lots of kind of awkward drawing at an awkward angle. Because, I mean, it is quite a distant shot and you can't make out that much detail, but it's still quite an awkward angle in terms of drawing the figure, and it's close enough up that you can still make out that they are figures. So going into Photoshop and trying to draw in all the rest just by eye was going to end up taking too long. So in the end, I just went back to DAZ, as you can see here, and started doing multiple renders, moving the figures around, using sort of the ones on the extreme edges as a marker, so that I knew roughly where to place. Like so there's ones that are now on the right hand side, started off on the left hand side of the crowd, that kind of little crowd. Just so I knew I wasn't placing people too far apart or too close together. So that's a little bit better. I played with the spotlights a little bit, so the shadows are less kind of severe and conflicting. So excuse me a second. And I now go on to, quite at some considerable length, pose all these figures again and again and again, and render a number of times in order to create a composition that works. Now, you'll notice there's only 6 minutes left on this tutorial, and admittedly the action is sped up a little bit. Well, sped up considerably. But it is worth noting that everything, from this point to the end, represents the entirety of the time, pretty much, that it took to do that overhead shot of the crowd, albeit multiplied by how much this video has been sped up. But in comparison to the other two images, which were sped up just as much for this, it's a far smaller amount of time. A lot of that's because I'm not having to go into as much hand rendering, or not as much careful hand rendering, because the detail of the figures is so kind of indistinct from that difference. That's one of the real advantages of using DAZ, is that for shots like that, where you're seeing the figures from so far away that the little details that would be weaknesses in the 3D model usually, you really can't pick up on. And if you put, if you do like a stamp filter in Photoshop, my advice typically would be bring them into Photoshop, rack up the resolution from, they usually render at about 96 dpi, bump that up to 600 for the time being while you're working with the DAZ render. 600 dpi, then use the stamp filter, black and white, use the stamp filter, and sort of play around with the darkness levels on the stamp filter just to see what gives you the best indication of the, sort of what describes the forms best. And use that as the basis for your kind of penciled panel. Like I say, in an instance like this, that render does a lot of the work for you. Like here I am combining all the different renders I did of those figures, and it takes me a little while to just kind of, import them all, then erase the sort of sections of them so that all the figures in the scene are exposed. That takes up the majority of time in this one, but that's not something you have to do that often. You don't have to draw really extensive crowd scenes that often. I mean, they crop up now and again. No getting around them, really. But hopefully they won't crop up too often. Usually be able to get away with a close-up or something. So this is kind of a rare thing that you have to do. But once it's done, once I've got my kind of combined sort of collage render almost of all those figures, oh god, have I gone back into DAZ again? I think I have. What's going on there? Did I have a moment of realizing that I'd left a big area blank or something? I think I must have done. I hope the Photoshop stuff is in this tutorial. Is in this video. Otherwise, I'm going to have to do all of that again. That would be annoying. Like what I said, I would have to, put the video into an editor again and export it all again, which takes ages. Well, fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Come on. God, there's only 3 minutes of this tutorial left, this video left. Oh. Right, I'm in Photoshop again. That's a good sign. There we go. Right. Hacking away all of that background. So here we go. You can see there's really starting to get a sense of the full image. And with judicious lighting and stuff, those figures are kind of disappearing a little bit into the darkness, and that's going to save us some time as well. So once all those renders have been kind of comped together to create one super render, it's really quite amazing how quickly the panel kind of comes together from 3D render to penciled, like comic book penciled panel in a very short space of time. Getting there. Just erasing all that ground. I kept the ground. I could have rendered all this without the ground in the shot, and that way I could have had a sort of transparent background. I comped all of them together without having to do all this erasing, but I wanted to keep the shadows of the figures on the ground, because they would fill up, even more space and create a nice light and dark balance and everything, rather than having to kind of judge the shadows by eye. Everything here is sort of done for the purposes of kind of convenience and ease. So yeah, there we go. Bang on a filter, and look how close that is to the finished result. Very similar. Now all I do is I go in with the brush tool, sort of, suggest some figures. But time's almost up on the video, so I will leave it there. The rest is pretty sort of self-explanatory, just filling out those little details quite roughly. But thank you very much for watching this. And if you feel the need to get in touch with me, I'm on Twitter at JumbleCashback, JumbleCashback. Thanks again for watching, and happy drawing, and have a lovely lifetime's worth of experiences. See you later. Thanks again.